Chapter 7. Getting Out. Reyes stayed close to Gagara as he escorted her through the throng back towards the door of the cage. He held one of her arms in both of his and attempted to comfort her and keep her mind off where she was. "I'm sorry, handsome," Gagara said. "I know you're strong. Nothing seems to bother you." Reyes thought about the moat around Domov Castle and the way he was so scared of falling in that he had actually aimed himself at the land when he fell out of the sky. He decided not to mention it to Gagara though. She had a lot on her mind at the moment and he didn't want to compound her fears by mentioning his own. "I just know that if anyone can find a way out of this cage, it'll be you," Gagara was saying. "I guess it's not too bad in this cage. At least I can see the sky. I know it's there. It's just out of reach beyond these bars. I guess my main fear was that I had lost you." Reyes let Gagara talk. It seemed to be helping to take her mind off her situation. He stroked her hand gently to let her know that he was listening. A group of humans scurried out of the way as Reyes and Gagara approached. Reyes wanted to stop them. He wanted to talk to them and try to reassure them that he was on their side. Somehow, he doubted it was worth the effort. Who was going to believe him even if he could get a human to listen to him? Besides, Gagara needed his attention more right now. "They took my pretties," Gagara complained. "I spent my entire life gathering the most beautiful pretties I could find. They took the lot." "I'm sorry," Reyes replied, turning his head so he could look at her. "We'll get them back." "They chucked them away," Gagara said. She rested her head lovingly on Reyes' shoulder and said, "One of them opened the pouches of my belt in front of me. I was forced to watch as he poured the stones into his hand and threw them to the ground." The way Gagara told it, Reyes could imagine a couple of elves holding her by the arms while a third took great malicious pleasure in forcing her to watch as he chucked the stones away. Reyes was too aware that it was more likely Gagara had simply been close enough to see as the slaver had checked the belt for valuables, and having found nothing but stones, he had chucked them because to him they were worthless. Almost as an afterthought, and by way of trying to ease Gagara's loss, Reyes told her, "They took my stuff too." They were close to the door of the cage now. Orsa stood not too far to one side. There was a goblin with him, and it looked as if the two of them were old friends. The goblin had no tattoos of any description, suggesting to Reyes that he had been born in captivity. There were a number of creatures gathered near the bars, but there was plenty of room for Reyes and Gagara. Through the bars, the two elven guards could be seen taking their leisure near the table, on which was sitting the horn. One of the elves sat on a badly burnt, very rickety-looking chair. The other sat close by on a tree stump. Regardless of their orders, neither elf seemed to be paying too much attention to those inside the cage. Every few seconds, though, one would give the cage and those within a quick, cursory glance. "Do you really think you can get me out of here?" Gagara asked hopefully. "I think so," Reyes replied. "First, we have to deal with the guards. I daren't try to unlock the door with those two watching. They'll sound the alarm, and we'll be sitting targets before we got very far." "So," Gagara said, sounding concerned, "what do you plan to do?" "I'd like to send them to sleep," Reyes told her. "But to do that, I need them to get closer. I'm pretty sure that where they are, they're out of range." "You need them closer," Gagara confirmed. "Just a moment." She let go of Reyes' arm and approached the bars of the cage, getting as close as she could to the two guards. Once there, she raised her left foot and rested it lightly on a low horizontal support bar, wrapping her talons round it like a perch. Then she slowly lifted the hem of her skirt in order to show off as much of her leg as possible. "Hey, boys," she called, trying to sound as inviting as she could. "Either of you fancy a little bit of fun?" The elf sitting on the rickety-looking chair started to laugh. "What, with you?" At this comment, the other one, who up until now had been gawking, suddenly seemed to get the joke and began to laugh. "Why the—" Gagara began to mutter. She shifted her position with the obvious intent of removing her foot and replacing her skirt. "Stay there," Reyes told her. "Hold that pose." "But," Gagara protested, looking quizzically at him, the two guards might not be close enough for Reyes to send them to sleep, but there was another spell he could use on them at that range. It was an awkward spell to cast at the best of times because it required the recipient to be receptive to suggestion. With Gagara showing so much of her leg, maybe he could tune into the elves' carnal nature and convince them to come over. He cast the spell. "Are you seriously telling me you wouldn't like to find out what it would be like with a harpy?" Then turning quickly to the second, he repeated the spell, saying, "What about you? Wouldn't it be better with a girl who was willing?" The elf on the rickety chair continued to laugh. Clearly, that elf had no such desire, and the spell had failed to trigger even the most primal of the elf's lusts. For the other elf, though, things were different. He got up from the tree stump and began to walk the short distance towards the cage. I'm not sure how much fun we can have through the bars of the cage, but I'm willing to give it a shot. Gagara turned and looked worriedly to Reyes. Play along, Reyes told her. We need to get them both over here. Don't you do it, the Romanian elf called to his companion. You know our orders. The boss won't be happy if he catches you. That's right, Reyes said as he cast a spell at the still-seated elf again. Maybe you should remind your friend of his duty and drag him back. The elf jumped up from his chair and began to hurry after his friend. The first of the elves reached the bars of the cage, and he began trying to take advantage of Gagara through them. Gagara took a step back, but she hovered just out of the elf's reach and tried to look as enticing as she could. She acted a little shy as she beckoned the elf to join her inside the cage itself. Reyes waited patiently until he was sure the other had entered the range of his sleep spell. Then, in quick succession, he put them both to sleep. The two elves fell to the ground with much louder thuds than Reyes felt they had the right to be making, considering how little they were actually wearing in the way of heavy armour. This prompted him to check that no one outside the cage had heard the noise and was coming to investigate. Gagara seemed more than a little bit relieved. She gave a great sigh and straightened her skirt. Can you open the door now? Of course, my love, Reyes agreed. He was feeling quite furtive as he took a step back from the bars and began to examine the cage door carefully. The sight of something in the corner of his eye suddenly caused him to look in that direction, half expecting to see an elf approaching the cage to find out what was going on. But it was only Gagara trying to get a better look. Normally all Reyes would do to unlock the door was touch the lock with the first and second finger of one hand as he cast the spell. This he would follow up with a quick twisting movement of his wrist to stimulate the turning of a key. On this occasion, things were different. The slaver's mage had cast some sort of protective spell on the lock to prevent anyone from attempting to pick the lock. Reyes wasn't sure how close would be safe, but he felt he needed to keep at least 5 inches away, making the casting of an unlock spell that much more awkward. Reyes concentrated. Slowly, he began to imagine himself standing closer to the target than he dared do in practice. He focused the power into his hand, while imagining that the closer version of himself was doing the same thing. Then his imaginary self touched the lock as he set to casting the spell. The next thing Reyes was aware of was that he was lying flat on his back about 8 feet behind where he had been standing. His broken wings screamed with pain at the weight that had suddenly been thrown upon it. At the same time, Reyes' tail screamed with the angle at which it had been thrust under him, and he feared he might have dislocated it. Handsome, Gagara ran over and was by his side in a moment. Orso was also beside him within a moment. It was Orso who offered his one good hand to help Reyes back to his feet. You see, Orso commented, the door is protected. Thank you, Reyes grumbled. He felt quite uncomfortable. His entire body had just been a conductor for a spell, and it still felt as if the remnants of that spell were running through his system, trying to find their way out. Parts of him were tingling, and it felt as if blood was slowly returning to a part of the body that had just suffered from cramp. Others in the cage seemed to be catching on to the idea that something was happening. Some had started to keep an eye on him from the moment he had put the two guards to sleep. Now, with having just tried to unlock the cage, Reyes was beginning to gather quite a crowd. Even some of the humans, who generally would prefer to keep their distance from anyone who wasn't of their race, seemed more than a little interested in what was going on. Without even trying to listen, Reyes could hear the conversation of 2 humans who happened to be standing nearby. Did that harpy just cast magic? Don't be silly, harpies can't cast magic. It looked like magic to me. Evidently the one that had just spoken had approached a little too close to Reyes, because a moment later the other said, Keep your distance. These beasts can turn nasty at a moment's notice. And I doubt the elves bothered to declaw her before dumping her in here. Reyes didn't really want all the attention. It worried him. Too much attention might also attract the attention of a different kind. None of the elves seemed to be looking their way, but how long would it be before someone saw what was happening in the cage and wondered what was going on? If anything, Reyes was more than a little surprised that nothing had alerted the other elves yet. He had almost expected to look up and see half the slaver camp heading this way to see what was going on. Can you try again? Gagara implored him. She stood next to him and looked out at the free world beyond the bars. I don't think that would be a good idea, Reyes replied, resting an arm on one of Gagara's shoulders. I think I need to find some other way out of here. Gagara didn't really reply, but she did sound more hopeful. She reached up and stroked his arm contentedly. I need to think about how we're going to handle those guards on the rooftops. I should have thought about them before I put the other two to sleep. I guess I was too keen to get us out of here. If we break out of this cage, we'll need to deal with them pretty quickly, or they'll start to put arrows into us as we try to escape. What are you thinking? Gagara asked. I'm not sure. I think some of us will have to go up there and deal with them. The only ones suitable for such a task, really, are harpies. How many harpies do we have in this cage? Just you, me, Walag and Tishkara, Gagara replied. Reyes nodded slowly. Just the three of you, then. And you, Gagara repeated. Of course, we'll have to do something about the wing cuffs they put on us. Wing cuffs, Reyes commented. He had forgotten about the wing cuffs. His own wings felt so numb and uncomfortable from his broken bone that he couldn't even feel the cuffs holding his wings together. I'll deal with those now. Turn around. Gagara turned so that her back was to him. He could see where the slavers had pinned her wings together. A short chain attached to two small metal rings that held her wings closed in a way that didn't look and likely didn't feel natural to them. Reyes concentrated the unlock spell on the cuffs holding Gagara's wings together, and a moment later the cuffs snapped open and fell to the floor. Gagara flapped her wings a couple of times, and then she folded them back in a more natural configuration on her back. She seemed greatly relieved to have the cuffs removed. She then turned to face Reyes while he was busy removing his own wing cuffs. Now what? She asked. I'm not sure, Reyes admitted. I have all sorts of strange ideas, but I'm not powerful enough to do most of them. My teacher could probably just walk through the bars, or maybe she would teleport to the other side of them. I, on the other hand, am very limited in my abilities. So we're stuck here? Gagara said worriedly. I'll think of something, Reyes assured her. There was no way he was going to allow his child to be born into slavery. Besides, if he and Gagara were sold, they would probably never see each other again, and that was something that he simply wasn't willing to allow happen. He decided it was best not to worry Gagara with these thoughts, and instead told her, in the meantime, it might be an idea if you go and fetch Walag and Tishkara, so I can remove their chains and tell them what I want them to do. The elves on the rooftops, Gagara commented. She nodded and walked slowly away from him, mingling back into the crowd. As she walked, she flapped her wings once more, and then she disappeared out of sight behind a troll and an ogre. Reyes looked out across the village again. If anyone had noticed that the two cage guards weren't at their posts, then they hadn't done anything about it. Reyes considered testing the strength of the bars. As a harpy, he was quite strong, but these bars had clearly been designed to hold creatures of a lot more strength than he had. There were many stronger creatures in the cage. Maybe the best idea would be to find some way to weaken the bars so they could be bent. It made most sense to Reyes to head for the far side of the cage furthest from the cooking fire and from all the other elves he could see on guard duty out there. Even the elves on the rooftops wouldn't be able to get a very clear line of sight on him if he worked on the far side of the cage from them. Actually, there wasn't a lot at all on the far side of the cage from the cooking fire. There had been some buildings here at one time on this side of the village. All that was left were the large charred blotches on the ground and a few pieces of half-burned wood. Just beyond these blotches was the forest that surrounded the village. A single elven guard was visible, standing just inside the tree line. He was about the same distance from the cage as the slaver watching over those who were cooking. Although Reyes could only see one slaver, he was certain from the way that he never seemed to glance into the village that the elf wasn't alone out there. Reyes watched him for a minute. The guard moved a few steps towards the back end of the cage and then stopped. He took a few steps into the forest and almost left Reyes' sight. Then he re-emerged a moment later and propped himself against a sturdy-looking tree, still looking in the opposite direction from the cage. Then the sound of movement behind him caught Reyes' attention. Gagara had returned with both Walag and Tishkara in tow. I told them what you want of them, Gagara said. About the guard on the rooftops, Reyes asked. What did they say? Of course we'll help, Walag replied. She tilted her head gently to the side and then glanced at Tishkara with a smile. Tishkara nodded. I'd love to get my claws into their soft, pliant flesh. Just say the word, Walag added, looking back at Reyes. Turn around, Reyes told them. Let's get rid of those cuffs. It took Reyes only a few seconds to remove the wing cuffs from the two harpies. Then he turned his attention back to the bars of the cage. In his mind he worked through the short list of spells, trying to find something that would aid their escape. Could you burn through the bars? Gagara asked, trying to be helpful. I don't really know much in the way of fire magic, Reyes replied. What I do have wouldn't be powerful enough to burn through iron. I'm barely powerful enough to light a campfire. So what then? Gagara looked worriedly. The only thing I can think of is rust, Reyes commented. He looked at the bars and nodded his head just slightly. Yes, if I can weaken the bars enough with rust, then maybe we can pull them out. You have a rust spell? Gagara asked incredulously. You learn all sorts of strange things when you learn magic. Some spells might seem to have no real use, but they make the learning of more powerful spells that much easier, Reyes told her. I see, Gagara commented doubtfully. Well, if you think rust will work... Reyes ran his hand quickly along the length of the bars, checking it for weak points. Every bit of it seemed as strong as the rest of it. There were one or two blemishes, but nothing that really stood out as what Reyes would consider a weak point. He stepped back, cleared his throat, and absently scratched his arm. What he wouldn't give for that sword of his right now. The extra power such a focus would provide would make this task so much easier. Before he did anything, he checked once more on the elf guard hanging out near the edge of the forest. He had wandered a short distance, even more towards the back of the cage, and had found another tree to lean on. Reyes couldn't be very sure, but he thought the elf was chatting to someone. Certain that the elf wasn't looking his way, Reyes focused as much energy as he could in the index finger of his right hand and drew a short line across the top of the iron bar. As he drew the line, he pumped all the energy he could muster through his fingers and into the metal of the bar. It had been years since he had last cast his spell. Back then, the best he had ever got was a thin line of rust, and though it wouldn't be much, it would make a start that he could work on with successive spells. Reyes let his hand drop, and slowly the thin red line of rust appeared exactly where Reyes had drawn his fingers across the bar. Is that it? Gagara said, unimpressed. Reyes smiled grimly at Gagara and then turned back to the bar, intending to prepare himself for a second casting. Yet the first spell wasn't finished. Slowly the rust spread over a small area of the top of the bar. It began to eat deeper and deeper into the metal, and even began to break away in large lumps. By the time the rust stopped spreading, it had eaten through more than half of the bar's thickness. Reyes took a step back from his handiwork, his eyes wide with amazement. He knew he had to be more powerful than he had been last time he had cast this spell, since that had to be more than 3 years ago. He really hadn't expected such a result as this, though. He had been worrying about the slaver's mage coming over to bandage his wing and catch him in the act of trying to escape. Now, Reyes was sure he could get the bars open before the mage arrived. You see, he could hear someone say in flourish, that harpy does know magic. I told you she was using magic. Reyes didn't listen to any reply, if there was one. He still had a task before him. Confident that even he had the strength to break what remained of the bar at the top, Reyes squatted down at the bottom of the bar and repeated the same spell close to the horizontal support bar. It was tiring to pour so much power into one little area, but the effort was soon paying dividends. Once again the thin line of rust appeared where Reyes had drawn his finger across the bar. This slowly turned into an avalanche of rust, falling from the bar as it ate its way easily through the metal. Reyes climbed back to his feet and prepared himself to pull the bar loose. He had put a lot of effort into those spells. He had been expecting that it would take him 5 or 6 castings for the top and another 5 or 6 for the bottom, but he had managed to pour so much power into just the one casting of the spell on each part of the bar that he was sure it was already weak enough to break. He was also feeling very tired from having channeled more power than he had ever been able to channel before. Without the aid of a focus, Walag, seeing that Reyes was hesitating to finish removing the bar, stepped forward to help. She placed both her hands near the top of the bar and pulled hard. The bar snapped at its weakened point easily. Walag then set about bending the bar over, pulling it into the cage and pushing it down towards the ground. Normally there was enough springiness in these bars to make this task very difficult. With the bottom of the bar greatly weakened, though, that resistance was all but non-existent. Walag kept pushing until the bar snapped off at its bottom end too. That's it, Gagara said excitedly. She had been hovering close enough so that the moment the bar was removed she could be the first through the new hole and into the relative freedom beyond. Walag was caught by surprise and had to step to the side to allow Gagara past, or risk getting hit in the latter's hurry to get out. Gagara climbed through the newly made hole without any thought for anyone else. Only when she was on the other side of the bars did she stop and wait. By the expression on her face it was clear that she was very much relieved. Reyes didn't think there was a whole lot of difference from being on one side of the cage to the other, but to Gagara it clearly made all the difference in the world. Walag, with the iron bar still in her hand, was the next to pass through the hole in the bars. She nodded a slight greeting to Gagara and then stepped back from the hole enough for Tishkara to join her on the other side. Back to Goldspawn? Tishkara asked. Goldspawn, Walag agreed. Then we go our separate ways. Agreed, Tishkara replied. Reyes had assumed that the two were making plans for when the slavers had been defeated, and everyone would be free to go wherever they wished. It never occurred to him that neither Walag nor Tishkara had any intention in helping deal with the elves on the rooftops after all. Reyes watched almost disbelieving as the two of them took to the air and began to fly towards the elven lands to the north. "Hey!" Reyes called after them. He forgot to keep his voice down, so angry was he with Walag and Tishkara for deserting the rest of them. "What about the elves on the rooftops?" The only reply he got was the sound of Walag laughing as the two harpies continued to fly over the trees and out of sight. It was no good. Walag and Tishkara were gone, and they were taking the only real weapon, the iron bar, with them. It was then that things began to get worse. The elven guard on duty at the tree line had heard the commotion and had turned to see what was happening. He was now running towards the cage and the opening in the bars as fast as he could. There were 3 others with him, all emerging suddenly from the cover of the trees. 4 elves, and Gagara was alone outside the cage.